You're watching WGALG, Milwaukee's only news at 8.
Good evening. I'm Cynthia Jackson, and it's 1:30. Tonight's top story. We continue with breaking news from Milwaukee, where a major investigation is underway in the city's East Side neighborhood. Late last night, Milwaukee police arrested Jeffrey Dahmer, a local resident, on suspicion of multiple counts of murder. The arrest came after a frantic call to police by a man who claimed he had been held captive in Dahmer's apartment. We go now to the arresting officer Rolf Mueller, who has more details about last night's arrest. Good evening, Officer Mueller, and thank you for joining us.
Good evening. Last night, my partner and I were dispatched to an apartment complex on the report of a disturbance. When we arrived, we encountered a young man named Tracy Edwards, who claimed to have escaped from his captor, a man named Jeffrey Dahmer. Mr. Edwards told us that he had been held captive in Dahmer's apartment and had only been able to escape because Dahmer had passed out drunk. Based on the information provided by Mr. Edwards, we made the decision to take Dahmer into custody and conduct a search of his apartment. During the search, we discovered several items that led us to believe that Dahmer was involved in multiple crimes, including the murders of several young men and boys. We also found a collection of Polaroid photographs depicting the victims.
What was the other physical evidence you collected from Mr. Dahmer's apartment?
During our search of Dahmer's apartment, we collected a significant amount of physical evidence. This evidence included various items used in the commission of the crimes, such as knives, restraints, and other tools. We also discovered human remains, including dismembered body parts and decomposed in various states, as well as chemicals used in the preservation of bodies.
Tell me something. Were there any previous reports from the apartment complex before this incident that may have suggested he was a dangerous individual?
There were a few incidents that raised red flags and suggested that Dahmer may have been involved in suspicious activity.
Did anyone from the Milwaukee Police Department respond to those earlier reports?
I can't comment on that.
Welcome to True Crime by AI. I'm Matthew Cole. While I may not exist in the physical world, I am your host for this pulse-pounding journey through the world of crime as told by artificial intelligence. If you're ready to embark on this thrilling journey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay tuned for more captivating stories. This week we are beginning with the story of one of America's most infamous monsters. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was a notorious American serial killer and sex offender who murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes were some of the most heinous and disturbing in American history, and his case continues to fascinate and horrify people to this day.
But was Dahmer born evil? Is anybody? In order to explore this, we need to start in the beginning. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His parents were Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, who were both in their early 20s at the time. Jeffrey was the first child of the couple and had one younger brother, David. As a child, Jeffrey was considered to be a quiet and reserved individual who showed little emotion. Jeffrey was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and exhibited symptoms of depression and social anxiety at a young age. He also suffered from a sleep disorder and had trouble sleeping, which caused fatigue and irritability. Additionally, Jeffrey was diagnosed with a double hernia at the age of 4, which required surgery. He was often teased and bullied by his peers, which contributed to his feelings of isolation and low self-esteem. He struggled in school and had difficulty paying attention, which led to poor grades. His parents were aware of his struggles and sought help from doctors and counselors, but little improvement was seen. Dahmer's interest in taxidermy began at a young age and was fueled by his obsession with death and preservation. He would often collect animal bones and skulls and would experiment with preserving them using chemicals. Dahmer's use of taxidermy as a means of preserving his victims' body parts was a significant aspect of his crimes, as it allowed him to keep trophies of his victims and prolong his fantasy of having them with him. More so, some psychologists suggest taxidermy was a method for Dahmer to manipulate victims, even after their death. Jeffrey Dahmer's high school years were lonely, marked by a continued struggle to socialize or make friends. These would be his last years of innocence before a darker side of his nature began to take hold. He attended Revere High School in Richfield, Ohio, where he lived with his family during his father's work transfer. Jeffrey's only interest seemed to be his collection of animal bones, which he kept in his room. Jeffrey Dahmer's first known murder victim was Stephen Mark Hicks, a 19-year-old hitchhiker whom he killed in 1978. Hicks was born on January 14, 1959, in the small town of Bath, New York. He was the oldest of 3 siblings and was raised by his mother, who worked as a nurse. Hicks was described as being a quiet and reserved individual who was close with his family. After graduating from high school, Hicks moved to Florida to live with his grandparents. He later moved to Ohio, where he worked as a dishwasher and cook. He had aspirations of becoming a musician and played in a band with some friends. In the summer of 1978, Hicks was hitchhiking through Ohio on his way to visit his family in New York. He was picked up by Dahmer, who was also 18 at the time, and they went back to Dahmer's house in Bath, Ohio. Dahmer would later confess to luring Hicks to his parents' house with the promise of alcohol and killing him by striking him in the head with a barbell. He then buried Hicks's body in the woods near the house. Hicks's body was not discovered until 1991, when Dahmer was finally arrested and led the police to the location of the grave. Jeffrey Dahmer enlisted in the Army in 1979 at the age of 18. Some speculate that Dahmer joined the Army as a way to escape his troubled family life and personal problems, while others believe he joined to find structure and discipline in his life. He was assigned to a medical unit in Baumholder, West Germany, where he worked as a combat medic. However, Dahmer's struggles with alcohol continued, and he was arrested for disorderly conduct and was found intoxicated on the job several times while stationed in Germany. Despite being given a second chance, his behavior did not improve, and he continued to drink heavily and would face frequent discipline. In March 1981, Dahmer was given an administrative discharge from the Army, less than 2 years after enlisting. Dahmer's time in the Army was a failed attempt to turn his life around and put his criminal tendencies in check. His expulsion from the Army marked the end of his attempts to have a normal life, and he returned to Milwaukee to live with his grandmother. Jeffrey Dahmer's adult life in Milwaukee gave rise to even more criminal behavior and escalating violence. This period would claim the most victims in his 13-year-long killing spree. Dahmer's victims were mostly young, gay, or bisexual men and boys who were lured to his grandmother's house with promises of alcohol or money. Once there, he would drug and strangle his victims before having sex with their corpses and dismembering them in the basement. He would often keep the skulls and other body parts as trophies, and sometimes even ate parts of his victims. He would often lure victims to his apartment when his grandmother was away, and he also took steps to conceal the evidence of his crimes by dissolving the bodies in acid or storing them in his freezer. During this time, Dahmer was able to evade detection from the authorities by being very cautious and methodical in his criminal behavior. His grandmother kicked him out in 1988 due to his drinking, the men being brought home, and the strange smells coming from the garage and basement. Dahmer committed the majority of his crimes while living at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The building where he lived was a 2-story white brick apartment building located in a primarily residential neighborhood. Dahmer was able to maintain a relatively normal appearance to the outside world during this period. He held down a series of menial jobs, such as working in a chocolate factory and a blood bank, and he was able to keep up appearances with friends and family, although he had no close relationships or friends. He was also able to keep his apartment in a relatively clean and orderly state, despite the gruesome nature of his crimes. But some residents in Dahmer's apartment building started to suspect something. One of Dahmer's neighbors, Pamela Bass, reported a strong smell emanating from Dahmer's apartment, which she described as a rotting flesh smell. She also reported hearing strange sounds coming from the apartment, including drilling and sawing. When she confronted Dahmer about the smell, he explained it away as being caused by his experiments with taxidermy. Another neighbor, Sylvia Moore, also reported a strange smell coming from Dahmer's apartment and heard noises and saw strange sights. She reported seeing Dahmer bring young men into his apartment, and sometimes they never came out. Dahmer's neighbors' experience escalated to fear, confusion, and disgust. What was going on within the walls of his apartment? Despite his efforts to evade detection, Dahmer's criminal behavior eventually caught up with him. On the night of July 22, 1991, Tracy Edwards had a harrowing experience while being held captive by Jeffrey Dahmer. According to police reports, Edwards was picked up by Dahmer and taken back to Dahmer's apartment. Once inside, Dahmer held Edwards against his will and threatened him with a knife. During his captivity, Edwards managed to escape and ran out of the apartment, naked and bleeding. He flagged down a police car and informed the officers of what had happened. The police immediately responded and entered Dahmer's apartment. When they did, they were faced with a scene of shocking horrors. The apartment was cluttered and filled with the evidence of Dahmer's crimes, including body parts, bones, and other gruesome remnants of his 17 known victims. The walls and refrigerator of the apartment were covered with human remains, and police found a collection of human heads, limbs, and other body parts stored in the freezer and throughout the apartment. There were also various chemicals, tools, and other items that Dahmer used in his efforts to dispose of his victims' bodies. The apartment was also filled with the personal possessions of Dahmer's victims, including clothing, photos, and other items that he had taken from them. These possessions added to the macabre atmosphere of the crime scene and provided a glimpse into the twisted mind of this soon-to-be convicted serial killer. The following is a list of his known victims. Stephen Hicks, age 19. Hicks was Dahmer's first known victim, whom he murdered in 1978. He lured Hicks to his home and bludgeoned him to death. Stephen Tuomi, age 25. Dahmer murdered Tuomi in a hotel room in 1987. He drugged and strangled Tuomi and dismembered his body before disposing of it in a dumpster. The remaining victims were all lured by Dahmer into his grandmother's house or his apartment, all known to have been drugged, strangled, and dismembered. James Doxtator, age 14. Richard Guerrero, age 22. Anthony Sears, age 26. Raymond Smith, age 32, Eddie Smith, age 36, Ernest Miller, age 22, David Thomas, age 23, Curtis Straughter, age 19, Errol Lindsay, age 19, Tony Hughes, age 31, Conorak Synthesum Phone, age 14, Matt Turner, age 20, Jeremiah Weinberger, age 23, Oliver Lacey, age 23, Joseph Braidhoft, age 25. It is important to remember that these victims were real people with families and loved ones who were deeply affected by Dahmer's actions. The reaction to Dahmer's arrest was one of shock and disbelief. His family and friends were stunned by the revelation that the man they knew and loved was capable of committing such heinous crimes. His mother, Joyce, described her son as being gentle and quiet, and stated that she had no idea he was capable of such atrocities. His father, Lionel, also expressed his shock, and said that he couldn't believe his son was capable of committing such crimes. Dahmer's arrest also had a profound impact on the families of his victims. Many of them had been searching for answers for years and were finally able to find closure and justice for their loved ones. The news of Dahmer's arrest also brought attention to the issue of missing persons and the importance of continuing to search for answers in cold cases. In the aftermath of Dahmer's arrest, there was also a lot of media attention and public interest in the case. The details of his crimes were widely reported, and the public was both horrified and fascinated by the case. Dahmer's arrest also led to a renewed focus on the issue of serial killers and the need for better understanding and prevention of such crimes. The trial and conviction of Jeffrey Dahmer was a highly publicized and sensationalized event. The trial began on January 30, 1992, and lasted for nearly 2 months. The prosecution presented a large amount of evidence against Dahmer, including photographs of the victims' remains, tools used to dismember the bodies, and chemical compounds used to preserve the body parts. The prosecution argued that Dahmer was fully aware of the nature of his actions and that he had killed his victims out of a desire for power and control. They also presented evidence of Dahmer's previous criminal record, including a 1978 conviction for indecently exposing himself to a child, which they argued showed that Dahmer was aware of the wrongfulness of his actions. The defense argued that Dahmer was suffering from a number of mental disorders. These evaluations generally concluded that he had a number of mental health issues, including antisocial personality disorder, schizophrenia, and necrophilia. Antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, is a mental health condition characterized by a persistent disregard for the rights of others and a lack of empathy. Dahmer was diagnosed with ASPD as he showed no remorse for his actions and had a history of manipulation and deceit. Schizophrenia is a severe mental disorder characterized by a break with reality, such as hallucinations, delusions, and disordered thinking. Although Dahmer did not have full-blown schizophrenia, He had some symptoms such as hearing voices and experiencing hallucinations. Necrophilia is a disorder characterized by a sexual attraction to corpses. Dahmer was found to have necrophilia and had confessed to engaging in sexual acts with corpses. Overall, the psychological evaluations of Jeffrey Dahmer indicate that he had a complex mixture of mental health issues that likely contributed to his actions as a serial killer. Dahmer pleaded guilty to the 15 counts of murder, but pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. On February 15, 1992, the jury found Dahmer guilty but sane on all 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences, which amounted to 957 years in prison. Dahmer was incarcerated at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. The following was created using a transcript of Jeffrey Dahmer being interviewed by the FBI at the Columbia Correctional Institution. The interview helped color much of what drove Dahmer.
When did you first ever think about killing somebody?
When I was 6'6", when I was about 15 or 16, those fantasies started entering my head. Why they did, I don't know. I never thought it would really happen, but everything was set up so perfectly that one time in Ohio...
With the hitchhiker?
Yeah, that's no excuse for it, but it's just weird how everything was just perfect that one time.
Jeffrey, we didn't talk about in great detail about that fantasy. What was it that you'd be seeing when you closed your eyes? Were you aroused? What exactly was that?
Yeah, thoughts of a good-looking, well-built young guy, having total control over him. I don't know if killing ever came into play, but if that was the only way to keep him, then that would be done.
So it was a total domination factor.
Right, yeah, that...
Okay, what about dismembering?
That happened more as, necessity. The first time I didn't know how to dispose of the remains, and so... But once I started doing it, it became sexually exciting to me.
We talked about the roadkill. You brought it back and dissected it.
Uh-huh. Right, there was nothing sexual about that. That was just morbid curiosity.
What about with the humans?
That did become sexual as the years went by.
Maybe if you could detail for me the skin removal.
I did do that one time. I didn't know if it could be done. I wanted to see if it could be. It's possible. And just keeping mementos, the skulls.
How about other body parts?
Sometimes genitals, hands. That's about it. One time I tried to mummify one of the heads. I took the bone out of the back here and scooped the brain out and soaked the whole head with the flesh on it in acetone. And it worked for a while. That's the one I kept in the locker at work when I was at the work release program. But I just did that one time.
The prolific serial killer was finally behind bars. Jeffrey Dahmer's time in prison was marked by isolation and fear for his safety. During his time in prison, Dahmer was held in isolation for 23 hours a day for his own protection. He was also placed under constant surveillance and had limited contact with other inmates and staff. Despite the tight security measures, Dahmer was still a target for other inmates, and he received numerous death threats. He was known to be constantly looking over his shoulder, and was always fearful of an attack. While Dahmer was incarcerated at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, in July 1994, Christopher Scarver was also a prisoner. Also born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1969, Scarver had a difficult childhood, marked by poverty and abuse, and struggled with mental illness throughout his life. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and other mental health conditions, and he had a history of violent behavior. Scarver was sentenced to life in prison in 1992 for the murder of a man during a robbery. In 1994, he was assigned to work alongside Dahmer and another inmate, Jesse Anderson, as part of a cleaning crew at the prison gym. On November 28, 1994, Scarver, who had previously complained about the special treatment Dahmer received, bludgeoned both Dahmer and Anderson with a metal bar from a weight machine, killing them both. Scarver's motivations for the killings were not entirely clear. but he later claimed that he felt Dahmer and Anderson were mocking him, and that he felt they deserved to die. News of Dahmer's murder was met with disbelief by the public, as many people had become familiar with the gruesome details of his crimes, and the scale of the horror he had inflicted upon his victims. There was a sense of shock and disbelief that someone as notorious and evil as Dahmer could have been killed while serving a life sentence in prison. Jeffrey Dahmer's family was similarly stunned by the news of his death. His father, Lionel Dahmer, was quoted as saying that he was shocked and saddened by the news of his son's death. The family released a statement expressing their sympathy for the victims of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes and their hope that their son's death would bring some closure to the families of those who had suffered so much. Once Dahmer's autopsy was completed, his body was released to his family, who decided to have him cremated. Before the cremation took place, however, the medical examiner removed Dahmer's brain and preserved it in formalin. His mother, Joyce, was hoping his brain would be studied to determine if biological factors were at play for her son's behaviors. Lionel Dahmer sought Jeffrey's brain to be cremated along with his body, at his son's wishes. Ultimately, a judge ruled the brain to be destroyed in 1995. While biological factors could not be determined, many believe Dahmer's crimes were likely the result of a complex interplay of factors, including genetics, childhood abuse, and an underlying mental illness. Perhaps Dahmer's upbringing by his parents Lionel and Joyce Dahmer had something to do with the person he would become. Let's explore them more. Lionel Dahmer, Jeffrey's father, an analytical chemist, worked long hours and was frequently absent from the family home, leaving Joyce to raise their son largely on her own. He reportedly had a difficult relationship with his wife and son, and the family was described as being emotionally distant and disconnected. Throughout Dahmer's childhood and teenage years, Lionel was aware of his son's struggles with socialization and difficulties in school, and he sought help from doctors and counselors. However, Lionel was not aware of the extent of Dahmer's criminal behavior, and was shocked and horrified when he learned of the details of his son's crimes. After Dahmer's arrest and conviction, Lionel struggled with feelings of guilt and responsibility, as he believed that he should have been able to do more to prevent his son's descent into criminality. In an effort to come to terms with his son's actions and understand the reasons behind them, Lionel wrote a book entitled A Father's Story, which was released in 1994, several months before his son was killed in prison. In the book, Lionel recounts his experiences as a father, his struggles to understand and help his son, and the impact that Dahmer's crimes had on his life. He also reflects on his own feelings of guilt and responsibility and the public perception of him as being the father of a notorious serial killer. The book was published to critical acclaim and was seen as an honest and moving account of a father's struggles to come to terms with his son's actions. It also shed light on the emotional toll that such a crime can take on the family members of the perpetrator. Jeffrey Dahmer's relationship with his mother, Joyce Dahmer, was complicated and had an impact on his development as a person. Joyce Dahmer was described as a controlling and emotionally distant mother, and her relationship with her son was strained. She struggled with alcohol and mental health issues, and was frequently absent from the family home. Dahmer later described feeling neglected and emotionally abandoned by his mother during his childhood. Despite her difficulties, Joyce Dahmer did try to intervene in her son's behavior in his teenage years. She had noticed that he had become increasingly isolated and withdrawn, and took him to see a therapist, but the therapy sessions were short-lived as he refused to open up to the therapist. The relationship between Jeffrey Dahmer's parents, Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, was marked by conflict and dysfunction. They were often at odds with each other and had a tumultuous marriage that was characterized by verbal and physical altercations. Dahmer's relationship with his grandmother was reportedly closer than with his parents, and she was a significant figure in his life. He would often spend time with her at her home, and she provided a sense of stability and security in his childhood. Dahmer also had a younger brother named David, and their relationship was reportedly distant and uninvolved. David Dahmer later described his brother as being emotionally distant and disconnected from the family. Overall, Dahmer's family life was marked by a lack of emotional closeness and a sense of isolation and abandonment. This environment likely had a negative impact on his emotional development and may have contributed to his later deviant behavior. Dahmer's legacy has had a significant impact on the way serial killers are studied and understood by law enforcement and the public. His case brought attention to the concept of the organized versus disorganized killer, with Dahmer being considered a rare example of the former. He was highly intelligent and methodical in his crimes, and was able to evade detection for many years. But what about the victims? The families and loved ones of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims did receive some form of justice and restitution, although the process was complicated and emotional. The families of his victims were able to see justice served in a court of law, and they were able to hear the details of Dahmer's crimes in a public forum. In addition, some of the families of Dahmer's victims received monetary compensation from the state of Wisconsin, and some of Dahmer's victims' families were able to receive payments to help with the costs of funeral expenses, counseling, and other related costs. However, the process of seeking justice and restitution was complicated and emotional. Many of them struggled with the trauma of losing a loved one. Some of them also struggled with the notoriety of their loved one's case, and they faced public scrutiny and media attention. This has been the story of Jeffrey Dahmer. Was he a monster? A person with severe mental health issues? The essence of evil? These questions haunt us to this day. Remember, serial killers are not to be idolized. Sure, videos like this are partially meant for entertainment, but they're also meant to help educate the public so we can spot the individuals in our society that need serious help. We will see you next time on True Crime by AI. Good night.